You've been lied to about the Amazons. Everything you think you know, wrong, and what's buried in the ground right now might just rewrite history as we know it. So here's the thing. When you hear Amazon warrior women, you probably think of Wonder Woman or some fantasy movie, ancient Greek myths, stories told around campfires. Fiction, right? That's what historians said for thousands of years. They laughed at the idea, called it impossible, said there's no way entire societies of female warriors ever existed. But then archaeologists started digging in places they'd ignored for centuries. And what they found? It changed everything. The ancient Greeks didn't just mention the Amazons once or twice in passing, they were obsessed with them. These warrior women showed up everywhere in Greek culture, on pottery, in plays, in epic poems. The Greeks described them as fierce fighters who lived without men, who could shoot arrows from horseback better than any Greek soldier, who cut off one breast to draw their bows more easily. That last part, by the way, probably not true. We'll get to that. But here's what matters. The Greeks treated the Amazons like they were real, not like fantasy creatures such as centaurs or cyclops, but like actual foreign people they'd encountered or heard about through traders and travelers. The problem is this. For the longest time, modern historians assumed the Greeks just made the whole thing up. They thought the Amazons were a projection of Greek male anxiety about powerful women. A cautionary tale, a way to explore what if women were in charge through storytelling. And to be fair, Greek society was incredibly male-dominated. Women had almost no rights. They couldn't own property, couldn't participate in politics, couldn't even leave the house without permission in most city-states. So yeah, the idea of warrior women probably did make Greek men uncomfortable. But that doesn't mean the Amazons were purely fictional. Here's where it gets interesting. The Greeks were very specific about where the Amazons lived. They didn't place them in some mystical, faraway land that didn't exist. They said the Amazons came from the Black Sea region, the area around modern-day Ukraine, southern Russia, Kazakhstan. The Eurasian steppes, places that actually exist. And they described Amazon customs in detail. They said these women were nomadic horse riders, expert archers, that they wore pants instead of dresses, which the Greeks found shocking. They said Amazon women would meet with neighboring tribes once a year to get pregnant, then send the male children away and keep only the daughters to raise as warriors. Now the ancient Greeks had contact with the people who lived in those steppe regions. They traded with them, sometimes fought with them. These were the Scythians, Sarmatians, and other nomadic groups. The Greeks called them barbarians because they didn't speak Greek and didn't live in cities, but they definitely existed. And here's the crucial part. The Greeks specifically said the Amazons were connected to these nomadic steppe peoples. They even had a myth that the Amazons and Scythian men joined together to create the Sarmatian tribe. So the Amazons weren't placed in a fantasy world. They were placed in real geography, connected to real historical groups. For centuries, nobody bothered to check if this might be true. Then in the late 20th century, archaeologists started excavating burial mounds in the Eurasian steppes. These burial mounds, called kurgans, belonged to Scythian and Sarmatian nomads. And when researchers opened them up and analyzed the remains inside, they found something shocking. Many of the graves that contained weapons, armor, and arrowheads belonged to women, not just one or two outliers. We're talking about 20 to 30% of warrior graves from these cultures containing female remains. Women buried with battle injuries, women buried with swords and daggers, and hundreds of bronze arrowheads. One tomb in particular blew everyone's mind. In the 1990s, archaeologists uncovered a burial in Kazakhstan of a young woman who'd been laid to rest with serious honors. She was surrounded by weapons. Her skeleton showed signs of combat injuries, including a battle wound to the head. She'd been a warrior, no question, and this wasn't some isolated case. Tomb after tomb revealed the same pattern. These nomadic steppe cultures absolutely had female warriors, women who fought alongside men, women who were buried with the same honors as male warriors. The evidence kept piling up. DNA analysis confirmed that yes, these were biological females. Bone analysis showed they'd spent years on horseback, which leaves distinctive marks on the skeleton. Some had injuries consistent with drawing powerful bows repeatedly. Others had battle wounds, fractures from combat, embedded arrowheads. This wasn't symbolic. These women had actually fought. So the Greeks weren't making it up. They'd encountered or heard accurate reports about nomadic steppe peoples who had female warriors, and they turned these real women into the legendary Amazons. The Greeks probably exaggerated some details. The all-female society with no men allowed, that was likely an exaggeration based on the fact that these nomadic groups lived differently from Greeks, with women having way more freedom and power. The breast removal thing. Almost certainly fiction. There's zero archaeological evidence for it, and it would actually make archery harder, not easier. Any woman who does archery can tell you that. But the core of the legend, warrior women on horseback from the steppes, that part was real. Here's what we think happened. The Scythians and Sarmatians were nomadic peoples who relied on horses and herding. Unlike settled agricultural societies, everyone in these groups needed to know how to fight. When you're nomadic, you're vulnerable to raids. You need to defend your herds, your territory, your people. And unlike in Greek society where women stayed home, nomadic life meant women were out there with the herds too. They learned to ride, to shoot, to fight, because survival demanded it. In some of these cultures, women warriors weren't just accepted, they were respected, given leadership roles even. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the Sarmatians and said their women frequently hunt on horseback with their husbands and, in war, take the field and wear the same dress as the men. He said Sarmatian women couldn't marry until they'd killed an enemy in battle. Now, Herodotus got a lot of things wrong in his writings. He repeated rumors and exaggerated. But on this particular point about steppe women being warriors, he was describing something real. Another Greek writer, Hippocrates, talked about the Sarmatians and mentioned that their women rode horses, practiced archery, and threw javelins. He was puzzled by this because it went against everything Greeks believed about gender roles. But he was reporting what he'd observed or heard from reliable sources. These accounts match up with what archaeology has now proven. So we've established that yes, warrior women existed in the ancient world, particularly among the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppes. But does that mean the Amazons were a specific tribe or nation? That's where things get complicated. The Greeks talked about the Amazons as if they were one distinct group, a nation of women. But the archaeological evidence suggests something different. It seems like multiple nomadic cultures in the steppe regions had female warriors. The Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Saka. All of these groups buried some of their women with weapons and armor. So the Amazons the Greeks described were probably not one tribe, but rather a Greek interpretation of the various warrior women they encountered from different nomadic groups. The Greeks took these real warrior women and created a mythology around them. They placed them in their epic stories, had them fight Greek heroes like Heracles and Achilles, invented stories about Amazon queens like Hippolyta and Penthesilea. The mythology grew bigger and more fantastical over time, but it was rooted in truth. The real women of the steppes became the legendary Amazons of Greek myth. There's another layer to this story, though. Why did the Greeks care so much about the Amazons? Why were they so fascinated by these warrior women that they put them on pottery, wrote plays about them, included them in their most important myths? Part of it was definitely the shock factor. In Greek society, the idea of women fighting men was scandalous, almost obscene. It violated their whole worldview. So stories about Amazons were titillating and disturbing at the same time. But there's more to it than that. The Amazons in Greek mythology usually lose. When Heracles fights them, he wins. When Achilles faces the Amazon queen Penthesilea during the Trojan War, he kills her. When Theseus abducts the Amazon queen Hippolyta, the Amazons attack Athens, but are defeated. Do you see the pattern? The Greeks used Amazon stories to reassure themselves that even though these powerful warrior women existed, Greek heroes could still beat them. The natural order in Greek eyes could be restored. Men would triumph over these women who'd stepped out of their proper place. But here's what's interesting. Even though the Amazons lose in these stories, the Greeks portrayed them with respect. They weren't depicted as evil or monstrous. They were portrayed as brave, skilled, worthy opponents. The greatest Greek heroes fought them, which meant the Amazons had to be exceptional warriors to be worthy of those heroes. In Greek art, Amazons were shown as beautiful, powerful, exotic, different from Greek women, but not inferior to Greek men. That's a fascinating contradiction. The Greeks were both threatened by and impressed by these warrior women. The Romans were also obsessed with the Amazons. They inherited the Greek stories and added their own spin. Roman writers placed Amazons in their historical accounts of distant lands. Pompey the Great claimed to have encountered Amazons during his campaigns in the East. Julius Caesar mentioned them. Were Romans actually meeting female warriors, or were they just repeating old Greek stories? Probably a mix of both. The Sarmatians were still around during Roman times, and they still had female warriors. Roman soldiers probably did encounter women who fought, and the old Amazon legends gave them a framework to understand what they were seeing. Fast forward to the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Europeans were still talking about Amazons. Explorers claimed to have found Amazon tribes in Africa, in Asia, in the New World. When Spanish conquistadors explored South America, they reported being attacked by fierce female warriors along a great river. That's why we call it the Amazon River today. Were there really warrior women there? Maybe. Some indigenous groups in the Americas did have female fighters and leaders. Or maybe the Spanish were seeing what they expected to see because they'd grown up on stories of Amazons. Either way, the legend persisted for thousands of years. In modern times, the Amazons became symbols. First-wave feminists in the 19th and early 20th centuries loved the idea of ancient warrior women. The Amazons represented female strength and independence. During World War II, Wonder Woman was created, an Amazon superhero who fought for justice. She became one of the most iconic female characters in popular culture. Today, the word Amazon still means powerful woman. Female athletes get compared to Amazons. Strong female characters in movies and games get called Amazons. The legend has lasted over 2,000 years. But now we come back to the archaeological evidence. What does it actually prove? We know for certain that women in Scythian, Sarmatian, and related steppe cultures were warriors. We have the graves, the bones, the weapons, the battle injuries to prove it. We know the Greeks had contact with these cultures and heard about or encountered these warrior women. We know the Greeks then created elaborate mythologies around them. So in that sense, yes, the Amazons were real. Not exactly as the Greeks described them, but real enough. However, here's what we don't have evidence for. We don't have proof of an all-female society with no men allowed. Every warrior woman grave archaeologists have found has been in mixed cemeteries with male warriors too. These women fought alongside men, not separate from them. We don't have evidence for a matriarchal society where women ruled over men either. The steppe cultures seem to have been more egalitarian than Greek society, with women having more freedom and power, but that's not the same as women being in charge of everything. And we definitely don't have evidence for the breast removal thing, despite what some ancient sources claimed. What we have is evidence for something that's almost more interesting than the Greek myths. We have proof that ancient warrior women existed in significant numbers, that women in these cultures learned to fight, to ride, to hunt, to lead, that they were buried with honors equal to male warriors, that they lived lives of adventure and danger and freedom that Greek women could never imagine. In a way, the reality is more impressive than the myth because it's more nuanced and complex. So were the Amazons a myth? Yes, in the sense that the specific stories Greeks told about them were mythology. Stories about gods and heroes interacting with Amazon queens, cities of only women, battles where the natural order was threatened and restored. Those are myths. Were the Amazons a lie? No, because they were based on real women. The Greeks didn't invent the concept of warrior women out of nowhere. They encountered or heard about real female fighters and built their mythology around that reality. Were the Amazons a lost civilization? Not exactly. They weren't one specific civilization that disappeared. They were multiple nomadic cultures whose warrior women left traces in the archaeological record. Cultures that eventually blended with other groups, evolved, changed. But their legacy survived in the stories. Here's the lesson in all this. For centuries, historians dismissed the Amazons as pure fantasy because the idea of warrior women didn't fit their assumptions about the past. They figured ancient societies were all patriarchal like Greece and Rome, so the Amazons had to be fiction. But they were wrong. The past was more diverse and complex than anyone realized. Women in some ancient cultures had power and freedom that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the modern era. By assuming the Amazons were myth, historians overlooked real history for generations. This happens a lot, by the way. Myths and legends often contain kernels of truth. The Trojan War was considered pure mythology until archaeologists found the actual city of Troy. Stories about ancient tsunamis and earthquakes were dismissed as superstition until geologists found evidence those disasters really happened. Indigenous Australian legends about the land being connected to islands turned out to be accurate memories of Ice Age geography. Myths matter because they preserve cultural memory, even if the details get exaggerated over time. The Amazon story specifically challenges us to question our assumptions about gender in the past. We tend to project modern Western ideas backward and assume all ancient societies were like Victorian England, with rigid gender roles and women stuck at home. But the truth is messier and more interesting. Different cultures had different ideas about what men and women could do. Some gave women way more freedom than others. The nomadic peoples of the steppes needed everyone who could fight to fight, so they trained their daughters alongside their sons. That made practical sense for their way of life, even if it shocked the Greeks. The warrior women of the steppes weren't fighting against their own culture's gender norms as some kind of ancient feminists. They were living according to their culture's norms, which happened to be very different from Greek norms. That's an important distinction. They weren't rebels or exceptions. They were doing what women in their societies were expected and trained to do, which in some ways is even more interesting than if they'd been individual rebels fighting against tradition. So what happened to these cultures? Why don't we still have nomadic warrior women on the steppes today? The nomadic way of life gradually declined over centuries. Agricultural societies and later industrial societies took over more and more territory. Nomadic groups were conquered, absorbed, or forced to settle down. The Scythians were eventually replaced by the Sarmatians, who were eventually replaced by other groups. The lifestyle that created the conditions for warrior women slowly disappeared. By the medieval period, the great nomadic empires of the steppes had changed dramatically. Some traditions survived in groups like the Mongols, and yes, there were some Mongol warrior women too. But the specific cultures the Greeks encountered were gone. Their legacy lives on, though, in the archaeological record that's still being uncovered, in the DNA of modern populations across Eastern Europe and Central Asia, in the stories that have been passed down for millennia, and in the inspiration they provide today. Every time someone challenges assumptions about what women can do, what roles they can fill, what they're capable of, the Amazons are there in spirit. Not the mythological Amazons of Greek fantasy, but the real warrior women who rode across the steppes 3,000 years ago. The next time you hear someone dismiss a myth or legend as impossible, remember the Amazons. Remember that historians were absolutely certain warrior women never existed, right up until archaeology proved them wrong. Remember that the past is full of surprises, and our assumptions about how things were are often based on limited evidence and modern biases. Remember that truth can be stranger and more interesting than fiction. The Amazons were real. Not exactly as the Greeks imagined them, but real enough. They lived, they fought, they died, and they were buried with honors. Their bones lie in graves across the steppes, surrounded by the weapons they wielded in life. And after thousands of years, we're finally understanding who they really were. Not myths, not lies, but a piece of our shared human history that we almost lost because we didn't believe it could be true. If this changed how you think about ancient history, hit subscribe for more myth-busting content.